I'm going to kind of tell a cautionary tale, I guess, about relying too heavily on models to drive non-point source programs. And this is basically stems from a major report we did for the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. So there's a TMDL in place in the Chesapeake Bay that's the largest TMDL ever implemented. And I've been part of the EPA Chesapeake Bay Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee for the past 10 years as a body of approximately 40 different academic and government scientists that try to guide the EPA Chesapeake Bay program on water quality improvement practices. And so we did this major report. It was released last year, May of last year, trying to identify some of the response and implementation gaps that we're seeing in the Chesapeake Bay program with respect to water quality, and particularly non-point source. We realized very early on that really was a non-point source contribution to water quality pollution that was really the big problem. And so I'll focus on that here. So the motivation for this report was simple. Since 1985, there's been mandates, and then in 2010, the TMDL, for the Chesapeake Bay estuary to improve its water quality. And so this is a time series of the percent water quality standards attainment in the Chesapeake Bay estuary from 1985 to 2020. And what you see here is that we've seen really very little water quality improvement over this 40-year period, nearly 40-year period. Trying to reach 100% attainment in the Bay, we're seeing somewhere between 25 and 30% attainment on any given year. And we wanted to know why, or look into why that might be the case. And so again, very, very early on, we realized that it was the non-point source pollution that was the major problem. The wastewater treatment plants have all upgraded to tertiary treatment. Their loads have declined dramatically in the past 25 years, whereas the agricultural mainly, but also urban non-point sources are a much larger proportion of the total load to the Bay. And so one of the major findings was that with respect to the TMDL and non-point sources was that we're not really seeing enough adoption or behavioral change in the watershed. We term that the implementation gap. So there just aren't enough BMPs on the landscape to meet the water quality goals that we've set out for in the TMDL. The other one was that these practices may not be as effective as this model, which I'll talk about in a minute, predict they are. And this is the response gap. So BMPs aren't working like we think they're working. But before I talk about sort of the model, I want to briefly go through the system. I'm not going to go through all the linkages here, but really the non-point source implementation policy in the Chesapeake Bay TMDL is really structured into three sort of tiers. There's the policy component, so the federal permitting, state non-point source programs, and then the accounting system, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that gets implemented. We're trying to change these behavior in the watershed, so behavior of water quality managers, producers and land managers, and service providers as well. And all that happens before you get down here to this physical response. So this is the physical response to the watershed. What sort of loads are we seeing leaving the watershed? And again, pretty complex. There's linkages among all these behavioral components, the policy component, and the physical response. And I guess just to point out here, it's a complex system. Lots of linkages, lots going on. There's a lot going on before we ever reach, BMPs being installed, best management practices, I should say. So these are the practices we install on the landscape to, we believe, try to improve water quality. But there's a lot going on here before we ever talk about implementing BMPs, and that largely gets ignored in the program for the Bay. I guess I'd also point out that there's a lot of uncertainty. All these linkages and levels have a great amount of uncertainty associated with them. And there's tremendous heterogeneity and diversity, again, across all levels and linkages in this system. So what does the TMDL rely on to track, progress in meeting the TMDL? Well, it relies on this model called CAS, which is the Chesapeake Assessment Scenario Tool. It's just a basically empirical model. Uses lots of export coefficients to predict the average nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment reductions from BMPs, and it does it at a really coarse scale. So 20,000 acres is the finest sort of unit it predicts at. A lot of them are quite a bit larger based on geomorphic and land use conditions. And the point here is that this model makes a lot of simplifying assumptions about how the watershed operates and how non-point sources are integrated into that watershed. Really, it just takes nutrient input sources like fertilizer, manure, and atmospheric deposition, multiplies them by some export coefficients and estimates of runoff losses to get in first case, the average NMP sediment losses from that land unit. And then when BMPs are applied, the average reductions from BMPs. And the point here is that all the decisions that the states and the water quality programs make are based on estimates from this CAST model, right? So there's no real empirical data. There's not a whole lot of measurement that underpins this. Yes, the model is to some extent calibrated to, major river monitoring stations, but it makes a lot of simplifying assumptions. And so really this model is what drives implementation of BMPs across the landscape. And so the standard water quality program, particularly agricultural BMP program, what they do is they offer a part of the cost to install a BMP, 40% to install a manure storage lagoon or something like that. They don't cover 100% of the cost share. And that's intended to drive adoption by, let's say, producers in the watershed who adopt that BMP across the landscape. And then what the program does is assume that since that BMP is installed, it's, say, reducing phosphorus loss by 30%. So the state reports the number and types of BMPs using that sort of removal efficiency and the acres treated. That gets put in the model, and the model says, okay, well, you've reduced phosphorus loss by 20% across that the area that BMP covers. The problem with this is that, first of all, producers aren't usually going to adopt BMPs that don't improve their production practices. So in this program, you see a lot of BMPs being cover crops and nutrient management plans. You don't see a lot of innovative BMPs that might be quite effective at reducing nutrient loads because they're too expensive and they don't improve the bottom line of producers. And so what does this lead to in terms of an actual water quality response? One of the questions we asked was, is the watershed responding to management as expected? And so on the top here, I'm showing predictions from this CAST model, again, simple export coefficient model for total nitrogen and total phosphorus for these different sources in the watershed. And I'm going to focus on the non-point sources here, so crop, pasture, and urban non-point source developed there in gray. And so what the CAST model tells people, and again, this is the model that drives implementation of BMPs in this watershed, is that, maybe it doesn't, is that, for nitrogen, we're seeing some moderate reductions from 1992 through 2012. So a moderate reduction in nitrogen. And for phosphorus, it's actually a little bit more significant. So quite a significant reduction in total phosphorus losses across that non-point source sector over that 20 or so year period. The problem is when you compare that to empirical data or measured data, so this is empirical estimates using the Sparrow model for TN and TP, we see quite a different trend. So for nitrogen, you could probably argue it looks somewhat similar. So total load delivered to the estuary declined a little bit based on CAST, pretty much no change based on Sparrow. But the real discrepancy occurs for phosphorus, where the empirical or the measured data are telling us something quite different than what the water quality program policy model is telling us. In fact, it's telling us that total phosphorus losses have increased quite substantially over that 20-year period. And so we wanted, well, that was all there. So this is just another example. This is a slide I used on Wednesday at a symposium in Virginia, looking at non-point source programs in Virginia and how they're functioning to improve water quality. And so this is a figure showing 3 different time series. 2 are that CAST model here, just different versions of it. And 1 is the empirical estimates. So this is basically WRTDS, so watershed regression on time, discharge, and season. So it basically normalizes the flow, takes out some of the interannual variability. And we're looking at the phosphorus percent of 1995 load here. So 1995 was the base year that the TMDL is using to estimate water quality improvement from. And so you can see here that if you look at the estimates from that CAST model, sorry, that's the WIP target as well. So that's the goal we're trying to reach there. We've got to reduce our phosphorus losses by about 40% from 1995. You can see that the CAST model says we're there, right? We've made our goal. If you look at the measured data or the empirical data, it suggests quite the opposite. Again, quite substantial increase in total phosphorus losses in this, 3,000 square mile or so watershed here. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the things we identified as opportunities to improve non-point source programs. Because like I said, this program relies almost entirely on that one model to drive all of the implementation in the watershed. So something we thought quite a lot about in this report was what are the opportunities to improve non-point source program performance. And one of the things we arrived at quite early on was the nutrient mass balance problem. This was talked about a little bit in the nutrient inventory in the previous slide. It's a little bit different terminology here. I'm showing an example basically based on a farm, right? So the nutrient mass balance basically describes the inputs and the outputs and the change in storage of any constituent. In this case, we're going to talk about nutrients. Oops, sorry. I need to stop using the animation. It never works. So for nutrient imports, you have imports of feed, fertilizer, maybe bedding and manure, could be animal numbers here as well. Those are importing nutrients into this farm system. Could be a watershed, it could be any system you're looking at. And there are nutrient outports, so products and crops, animals, manure. I think I had biomass down here as well earlier. And so what you want to try to do is balance those two so that you don't get this surplus occurring. So in a lot of the watersheds in the Chesapeake Bay, we see a pretty significant surplus of particularly phosphorus in those heavy livestock regions. So what happens when you get that surplus is you get the buildup of those nutrients in the soils or groundwater or biota. And those also lead to increased exports in water and for nitrogen atmospheric losses. So we thought this was something where better data and monitoring of particularly farm level mass balances could go a long way to improving the program outcomes. And this is just an example of something like that. So this is a paper that was just released, Jimmy Weber at the USGS, looking at 3 different showcase watersheds in the Chesapeake Bay region, where the states and NRCFs have spent upwards of $250 million in these 10 square mile watersheds to improve water quality. And what they found was that over the past 3 decades, we've seen a nearly 400% increase in the number of BMPs installed in this watershed. So this is actually a stream I work in extensively. We're showing a riparian buffer here. Everything looks like it's being done right down by the stream. The problem is that they've also seen a pretty significant increase in the number of animal units in this watershed. So they've more than doubled, right, up here, those animal units in that watershed. Can anyone guess what the water quality trend might look like? It's actually increasing. So both TN and TP are increasing quite substantially, particularly for TP, due to the result of that, increasing in that mass balance. We also found that nutrient loads, they not only vary across space and time, they also vary across land managers. So this is a study actually in the Shenandoah Valley, a heavy livestock area of the Chesapeake Bay region, looking at the phosphorus mass balance across 58 dairy farms. Again, these farms are all located within 30 or so miles of each other, so similar geographic region, similar farm types, but you see a huge range in those phosphorus mass balances from farms that are, basically storing phosphorus. They're not releasing the phosphorus to the environment, to farms with 100 kilogram per hectare mass imbalance. So there's 100 more kilograms per hectare coming to that farm than is leaving in crops or protein. And so we don't really know anything about what the distribution of, say, phosphorus or nutrient mass balances might look like across the watershed. And these are just 2 kind of example distributions of what different farm types might look like. Again, this is a place where more monitoring and analysis of data could go a long way to improving our understanding and management of the system. And then finally, one last example would be looking at sort of spatial targeting of nutrient hotspots across the landscape. So the way the CAST model works would be represented by this figure on the right here. So we're using basically average conditions under huge areas. So, you really can't kind of distill down to a field level and determine what's going on. And so we did some analysis on looking at what the phosphorus loss might look like under different or under site-specific conditions. And so you can see here that under site-specific conditions, there's relatively small areas of landscape that are these hot spots of total phosphorus loss. And so, would you manage this landscape any differently if you assumed one versus the other? I think you probably would. And then finally, some of the innovation that we had talked about or proposed in this report dealt with trying to incorporate outcomes into the kind of loop here, right? So down here in the bottom left is how CAST operates now. So CAST drives the implementation programs, producers adopt, there's a BMP, they report it back. Well, what if we thought about it a little bit differently? So what if instead of BMPs being the metric we were trying to reach, what if it was outcomes? And that could be any number of things. It could be, a decrease in soil test phosphorus, or decrease in the nitrogen mass balance, or an actual ambient water quality measurement. And if we focused on those, could we improve those outcomes? And that would necessarily need to include additional monitoring and analysis, either or finer scale modelings. And the other sort of component of this would be to pay for actual outcomes, right? You're not paying for a practice to be installed. You're paying for a reduction in phosphorus loss from this watershed or some other outcome. And so we thought that might be a little bit different way to think about how this program might evolve to improve water quality. And again, this is just another example of that. So if we want to incentivize outcomes, we can think about it along a spectrum. So you've got these 3 BMPs, cover crops, exclusionary fencing, and a bioreactor. And there's sort of continuum of installation costs and benefits, right? Cover crops are low cost. They have private producer benefits. That's why they get adopted readily. You have these bioreactors, which has high upfront installation costs, doesn't provide a producer with any benefits. Why would they adopt that? But under voluntary cost share programs, right, which is what most of the agricultural BMPs are, adoption rates fall from left to right. So that's why cover crops are so widely adopted. They improve production practices. And then I could sort of have 2 questions with this. So which is the most cost effective? And maybe that's sort of just a general question. Cover crops are cost effective for producer, but probably don't provide a whole lot of environmental benefit. Whereas bioreactors might be very effective at reducing nitrogen leaving a field, but they don't provide any private benefit. And then which practices provide the most assurances of delivered reductions? Again, it's very hard to go out and quantify how much nitrogen a cover crop is actually prevented from leaving a watershed, whereas something with a pipe in and a pipe out, you could perhaps measure much more easily. Again, another opportunity to incorporate enhanced measurement into the system. So with that, that's